Hey, welcome to the Pinocchio Project. I'm your host, Mitch Friedman. I'm wearing a little Adidas hoodie, not a hoodie. I wish I had a hoodie. Adidas hoodie? Feel free to send me an Adidas hoodie. I'm a hoodie junkie. I'm wearing an Adidas beanie because here in Central Texas, it's very blustery, not conducive to outdoor flourishing. And speaking of flourishing, this podcast this week is particularly the result of content on human flourishing that I have been consuming this week, mainly from sources like the New York Times and Al Mohler's The Briefing. And you might say, Mitch, those are two polar opposites as to worldview. And I would respond with, you're right, and that's why I consume them. I get my content from all kinds of places, all kinds of sources, to examine whether or not I'm building my worldview appropriately. You know, the goal here at the Pinocchio Project is to use a biblical worldview to examine everyday ideas that promise human flourishing to determine whether or not they deliver on their promises. And so today I've titled this podcast as a result of the content I've been consuming lately, and it's not anything new. It just has sort of come to a head in various places of news and survey and polling data. The update is that one is the loneliest number. That's the title of my podcast. One is the loneliest number. I don't know if you remember that song. I guess it's from the 60s or early 70s. I certainly remember it because I was a teenager going into the early 70s. And it's a really kind of a lot of minor chords. The guy's singing about how desperately lonely he is. And I guess he's also a mathematician because what he realizes is one is the loneliest number. And so the news culmination this week that's resulting in this episode of the Pinocchio Project is titled One is the Loneliest Number because there is an epidemic of loneliness in our culture. It's a sense of detachment. It's a sense of despair. It's a sense of being alone. It's a sense of not belonging. And it's resulting in all kinds of fruit. The symptomatic realities of this kind of detachment and loneliness and lack of belonging has all kinds of negative consequences that we would say are anti-flourishing, that do not aid the human condition. You know, flourishing is defined as healthy and vigorous growth, particularly as the result of a favorable environment. So think of a garden. A garden, you have to start with soil based on the type of seeds you're going to plant. You now do this workable recipe of all kinds of ingredients and chemicals and nitrogen, and I guess that's a chemical. Stay with me. In the soil so that the seeds that you place there are now aided in their healthy and vigorous growth. Well, the same is true in culture. The soil of culture then implanted with the seeds of human beings results in a crop based on what the soil has been prepared to produce. And tragically, our soil is not producing much that would look like human flourishing in many areas, particularly in this area of the need to be attached, the need to be in community, and the need to feel like I actually belong and there's something we share together. And so you can look for yourself at the New York Times this week reported the epidemic of detachment and despair and loneliness, thoughts of suicidal ideation, particularly in young adolescent girls. But it's epidemic throughout all the age demographics. It's funny. Not funny. It's. I think it's to be expected that much of this epidemic of detachment and loneliness and lack of belonging is blamed on COVID. But in truth, the soil had been prepared for decades or even centuries. And so today I want to examine from a worldview perspective why we should not be surprised. I mean, we should be alert. And if you're a member of the body of Christ, if you're a follower of Christ, then you should be alert and active in helping to bring hope to those who are detached, lonely, and do not belong. I mean, that is part of our mission. And business is good, unfortunately, all around. And there's someone or some ones in your sphere of influence that desperately needs you to be a deliverer of hope. And so I'm going to look at some logical and illogical propositions on what it means to belong, to kind of point out that you can't violate reality. You can't violate logic by making propositions of human flourishing that won't bring human flourishing. But there are many propositions on belonging and flourishing that are peppering you every day through your feeds, on your news, maybe in your mind because you've been breathing this cultural air so long. But before we start, I want to remind us way back when, probably early mid-season 1, when we talked about how to build a worldview, any worldview. We are all worldview junkies. The proposition is that if you're made in the image of God, and we would say you are, because we hold a biblical anthropology, and I dare you to argue against it in a way that's not illogical, inconsistent, and livable. But the beginning and most important question of any worldview is, what does it mean to be human? And all of us are wrestling with these questions about our existence at its basic level, and then whatever meaning and purpose and whatever roles are, and what's possible for us as a follow-up to just existing. But if any set of worldview propositions or any truth claims in a worldview proposition in whole have to pass 3 tests. I call them the guardrails of a functional worldview. And we're not going to get very far on this podcast. We're not going to talk about all 3 as they relate to propositions on flourishing relative to attachment and community and belonging today. We're just going to look at the logical elements based on the propositions and ideas. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. But we're not going to talk about anything but the logical aspects of some of the ideas about what it means to flourish in the way of attachment and community and belonging. But there are 3 tests. The first is the logical test. Is your proposition on human flourishing or truth, is it logical? A functional worldview must be internally coherent. It can't contradict itself on its face. And that's what we mean by logical. So let me give you just a general example before we get to the essence of our particular subject matter. So here is a logical proposition on what it means to be human. My life has intrinsic value and purpose because it is the product of an intelligent design and designer. Now you could stop with design if you want to make it personal, but the overall substance of this proposition is that I have intrinsic built-in value because I am now the focal point and the product of something or someone that put me together with a specific design. And so that is a logical statement of my existence. An example of an illogical statement would be this as to my existence. My life can be considered both purposeful and meaningful in a purposeless and meaningless universe. That somehow the expanse of cosmology around me that came into being just through some undirected random set of processes over billions and billions and billions of years and epochs, somehow I can have this inner sense of satisfaction that my life has direction and purposeful intent. That's just illogical. It's on its face contradictory. That in a completely random and undirected, purposeless environment, somehow I can have a security that there is a purpose and a meaning assigned to my life. I hope you can get this distinction. It's not that difficult. So the second worldview test, the second set of parameters that we attach to a set of truth claims, worldview claims, is after the logical test is what we call the factual test. And for you Christians, I'm going to give you an example here. So a factual proposition that we could build into our Christian worldview is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is on its face, at face value, evidentiary. That means it can be proven in the most rigorous forensic environment. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is, on its face, evidentiary as to history and attestation. If you're not a follower of Christ, this might be a surprise to you. I hope it's not a surprise to you if you are a follower of Christ, because this is a major point of our security and meaning and purpose as a redeemed image bearer. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is, at face value, evidentiary as to history and attestation. Attestation means it's been spoken of by people that are contemporary to the time of the resurrection. So it's actually a factual statement. Now, a non-factual statement would be someone who insists that none of this is true about Jesus' resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is, on its face, a myth, a false myth. You know, there's true myths too. We might get to that at some point in the Pinocchio Project. A myth constructed... Let me start over. The resurrection of Jesus Christ... I'm having too much fun. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is, on its face... The resurrection of Jesus Christ is, on its face, a myth constructed by superstitious people whose motivations included the manipulation of other superstitious people. Now, don't hear me incorrectly. The resurrection of Jesus Christ as fact has been used by people to manipulate other people, and that's spiritual abuse. But the resurrection itself as a myth constructed for manipulation is not appropriate, because the resurrection is a fact. The third guardrail, the third set of guardrails for examining worldview claims, truth claims that are built into a worldview is the livability test. And we call this the experiential test. A worldview has to be experientially adequate, simply meaning, does it deliver on its promises? Is it livable over time? And so here's something I think is really important, and I guess I'm doing maybe two main streams in one here. I still need to get to the detachment, loneliness, and lack of belonging, and we're going to apply the logic test to those realities. This is really important. In regards to the reality of pain and suffering in our lives, some of which is chronically horrendous, some acutely horrendous, and for some people, both. That's probably the most intense filter for us wanting to legitimately examine the question of whether or not Jesus Christ lived, and if he lived, whether or not what he has promised me is actually reliable when I filter it through the reality of pain and suffering. So this is the livability proposition that must be woven into a Christian worldview. And many Christians struggle with this. And I struggle with it occasionally, not as much as I used to, because I've come to understand the whole message of the biblical text. And my worldview now is big enough for this reality, and it actually adds richness to my life. So here's the livability proposition. All of the seasons of my life, including seasons of pain and suffering, are threads of the tapestry that give my life meaning and purpose. So what I'm saying here is, and this is a biblical proposition, that pain and suffering are not just realities of a Christian worldview. They are actually part of what's weaving together the beautiful picture of my life and moving me toward maturity and forming me in the image of Christ, which is the biblical Christian goal for my life. That when I come to faith, I now begin this journey where pain and suffering, which exist regardless of whether or not I'm a Christian, but pain and suffering are used in the crucible of me being formed appropriately into Christ's image. And in that crucible comes necessarily my understanding that this is required of my commitment to grow. And as a matter of fact, without pain and suffering being appropriately understood, there is no Christian growth. There is no maturity. There is no movement on to being formed into the image of Christ. And this is where a lot of Christians opt out, quite honestly. And it's not like pain and suffering are no longer going to be part of the equation, but there's just some erroneous set of teaching. And a lot of this is on Christian teachers, pastors, other teachers in other places, or other proponents of what human flourishing looks like for the Christian. Human flourishing for the Christian looks like that pain and suffering are threads of this beautiful tapestry that are being woven together that give my life meaning and purpose and move me toward maturity in Christ. That is a legitimate, livable worldview statement from a biblical perspective. And your worldview has to be big enough to hold pain and suffering in its proper perspective in order to be really contented and have a dynamo of joy that's possible even in the most dysfunctional and chaotic circumstances. So that's the livable reality. Here's what I call an unlivable reality. That is, my life is meaningful when I experience maximal pleasure, maximal comfort, and minimal pain and minimal suffering. My life is meaningful when I experience maximal pleasure and comfort and minimal pain and suffering. Well, if this is true, that I should only consider my life meaningful when I'm experiencing pleasure and comfort and a minimum of pain and suffering, that means there's huge segments of my life that I have to consider that aren't meaningful and have no purpose. That's the implication. By implication, pain and suffering here in this proposition actually detract from my life's meaning and purpose. And that's like a roller coaster of, I'm experiencing some pain, some suffering, and some disquietedness and it's just not comfortable. I'm not at peace. So therefore, I need to set this aside and put it in the lateral file as wasted portions of my life. And that's a frustrating, exhausting model. If I'm just waiting for this season of dis-ease to abate, gosh. And unfortunately, many Christ followers have abandoned ship on their faith because of an improper orientation and a worldview that's too small to handle what's actually a necessary and, dare I say, beautiful necessity to my growth toward the image of God's Son. You can see these teachings all throughout the New Testament. The requirement, the necessity. There is no maturity without a proper orientation toward pain and suffering in my life. So those are just three examples, the logical test, the factual test, and the livable test. So now let me shift gears back to our beginning, and we're talking about the epidemic of in our culture of detachment, loneliness, and a lack of belonging. And there's a lot of reasons that are being offered from all kinds of camps on why we're experiencing this. I would offer that we're experiencing this in a heightened, accelerated way because we're literally just now reaping the fruit of roots that were grown over the last decades and even centuries, and seeds sown as far back as 250 years ago about what it means to be human, which is the most important worldview question that has to be, of the four questions. What does it mean to be human? What's wrong with this world? What can be done to solve the problems? And where is this thing going? What's the maturing or the destination? The most important is the first. What does it mean to be human? Because out of those answers will come your necessary answers to the following three questions. What are the problems? What can we do to solve them? And what's the end game? What's the narrative arc look like when this thing wraps up? And so unfortunately, the majority view in your zip code it insists over the last decades on answering the question, what does it mean to be human, very poorly at the beginning of that time of insistence, and it just degrades from there. It goes from origins to now what it means to have purpose and design and whose authority, or am I the authority? Because it's a slippery slope if you don't answer this question correctly as to origins. So let's just go here. Again, the Pinocchio Project's mission, we examine everyday ideas that promise human flourishing through a biblical lens to determine whether or not they can deliver on their promises. And so I would offer that promises being made in regards to what it means to to be attached, what it means to be in community and not lonely, and what it means to belong, have been absolutely degrading in their outcomes, based on what we say is necessary for us to experience human flourishing as individuals in Western thought. So I've just made a few notes here, examining the fruit of some really bad ideas sown for decades and even centuries in regards to what it means to belong together. Epidemics of detachment, loneliness, and lack of belonging are now resulting in acts of desperation and deaths of despair. I mean, how many mass shootings do we have per month? We're about to go to that question now, being ratcheted down to how many mass shootings do we have per week? I mean, who are we? I was praying with a group of people a couple of weeks ago, and I just broke down because I already knew the answers and how we got here, but it's still just overwhelming. Who are we? How did we get to this place where people are so detached from each other and so lonely and isolated and so lacking in any kind of either institutional or familial or relational context with each other, so connected that they just lose it? And it's either suicide or mass shooting, and in quieter ways, it's just dying a death slowly and shrinking on the inside. And we call it a mental health crisis. I would call it just a crisis of ideas. That's the soil, a crisis of ideas on what it means to flourish as a human being and what's necessary. So, in a way that's kind of snarky, I said, who are we? And I answered the question exactly who we've been told over the last decades and even centuries, now bearing fruit, exactly who we've been told we're supposed to be. And if this is all new to you, I mean, there is a roster of great reading. If you're interested in this conversation, just reach out to me at the Pinocchio Project. We have our link here on the feed, I hope, and also on the podcast platform. Just get a hold of me. I'll be glad to send you some resources. Not to depress you, but Jesus said that we need to be able to interpret these present times. We're really good with the weather. How about these present times? And I can help with that. So what I want to do now, I want to talk about detachment and what it means to be attached, and I want to talk about loneliness and what it means to be in community, and also belonging and a lack of belonging, and what it means now to come together. So what I wrote here was, and I think it's about the way I wanted to write it: to be attached and in community and belong to a group requires some important aspects of things shared in our humanity, and some important truths plural, but not plural to the individual, some important truths to be recognized. The enemy of shared aspects of humanity and truth is autonomy. And this is the cry of the human heart as conditioned over these last decades and centuries, that I am my own law, autonomos. I am my own God. I am my own authority. That's what autonomy is. My own law. Autonomos, a compound word in the Greek language. And anything that roots itself in the individual being the soul and solo or silo of all authority, self-described and prescribed truth, self-described and prescribed identity, is by definition going to distance itself from every other person, every other silo that's responsible to do those same things in the psychological self. The psychological self is now ruling the day. What I think on the inside about who I am and what my truth should be and how I'm going to express myself to you. That is the call of the individual in the zip code in which you live. And it hasn't been necessarily hidden. It's been subtly taking shape in the West over against decades and centuries. But in this moment, the autonomy based in the psychological self is, as it will always be, the enemy of shared aspects of both humanity and truth. So what I want to do now for just a few minutes, let me see how much time I've been going. And we got a few minutes here. So what I want to do here for just a few minutes is I want to apply the logic test to some propositions that are based in this autonomy. I'm going to do a logical one that's a really good one, and an illogical one based in these autonomies. And when I say these autonomies, there's nothing universal. Each individual is an autonomy. It's just like a collective of ball bearings that are bouncing against each other. And there's nothing adhesive. There's nothing common to the group. It's just bouncing off. Bumper cars at the carnival, it's just, every individual unit is its own world. And it makes it, I would say, impossible to have any shared aspects of humanity and any shared aspects of truth in which to bind us. And those two things are absolutely necessary. Shared humanity and its understanding of what it means to be human, and shared aspects of a set of universal truths, what's true for everybody, not just true for an individual. So here we go. Remember the three guardrails: logic, facts, and livability. But we're just going to focus on logic because that's all the time I got. You may say, Mitch, will you come back and do a podcast on the factual and the livable? I don't know. Maybe. Do you really want one? I could give you this in logic, and maybe you could formulate your own as to facts and livability. So here you go. Here is a logical proposition on belonging. We belong to each other at the very basic level of necessity because we are each products of an intelligent design or designer, the same intelligent designer. So we belong to each other at the most basic level just because of how we're formed. I can look at you and say, wow, look at you. You're like me. You're designed. I can look at I could look at a woman and say, wow, we have a lot of similarities. We have some differences, but we both have been designed the same way. And that automatically, gives me a sense of belonging. I remember, I don't have to remember too long because I still play. I play basketball at all levels: middle school, high school, college. I even played against some pros and summer leagues. And there's something about being on a team, and you guys and gals who are athletes and have played team sports, there's something about the belonging on their team. There's so many shared aspects that we have together. Of what brought us to this place where we understand what it means for us to have shared aspects as a team and move towards a goal together. And there's shared aspects of truth. There's certain truths on the basketball court that are inviolable, and you automatically know when somebody comes onto your team, especially when they're not willing to participate in those truths, and we're like, oh, this is going to be difficult, y'all. Somebody's going to be lonely, and hopefully it's that player that just we're all image bearers. So there's so much similarity between, a team and its shared aspects and shared truths, and actually the whole race and what's required to belong with shared aspects of humanity and shared truth. So a logical proposition is we belong to each other at the basic level of necessity because we're each the product of an intelligent design or an intelligent designer. Here's an illogical in the other direction, an illogical proposition on belonging. We belong to each other because, it's right here. We belong together even though we are the product of random chance over time. We are undirected, causeless, purposeless, and without any sense of common direction. No shared aspects of our humanity because we're all just so like microscopically fortunate to be here. Out of the millions and billions of possibilities, somehow we won the evolutionary lottery, or I won the evolutionary lottery. But I have nothing in common with you because if I'm the result of the same randomness as you are, and that doesn't even make sense to me at all. I mean, I don't even see how you could make a process out of randomness. But if we begin with the proposition that we all come from materialism and Darwinian evolution, without some sense of common design and that shared humanity that gives us intrinsic value, that sets us on a course for a detachment and a loneliness. And I think you probably think, man, you're parsing the baloney too fine. And I would say, no, I'm not, because it's that very entree in what it means to be human that has opened the door for all of these other now bolt-ons to Darwinian evolution or materialism as a cause, without any supernatural universal. All these bolt-ons have now taken this immaterial randomness and built this silo of individualism where I don't share any aspects of humanity and I build my own truth. So it's a process. It's a slippery slope of ideas that go from unthinkable to plausible to possible and then are practiced. Most of you probably, unfortunately, don't even think about these things at this level. You wake up one day and your kid says something to you, or the news says something to you, or you say something to yourself, and all of a sudden what you thought was unthinkable 30 years ago, because of the cultural air you've been breathing, it's now possible for you, and you go out and practice it, and you don't even know how you got here. And you could end up detached and lonely and with a sense of, I don't belong. So, the illogical reversal of the intelligent design as the basic union of all humanity is that there is no union. There is no design. There's just randomness and undirected. Here's another logical proposition on belonging. We belong to each other because we are designed with a hunger for social and relational harmony. Built into us, and from a biblical worldview, it's built into us as it is a reality in our Creator, in our designer. He, the God of the Bible, is triune. He is Father, Son, and Spirit, and they live in community. Genesis 1:26, let us make man and woman in our image. And so that same reality, as the image is now formed in us, becomes a hunger. We belong to each other because we are designed with a hunger for social and relational harmony. And the illogical is most often formed by the fact that I'm now a fallen image bearer. I am now someone who's tainted by the reality of sin in the fall, and it's passed on to me. And so I have this standoffishness to being really transparent, and I quench that hunger by using one-offs to fill that social and relational harmony. And I need to be able to forgive people. I need to be able to be authentic with people. I need to be able to be transparent with people. But there's an obstacle in the way, and that's sort of my fear and my shame. It's called the intimacy paradox. This intimacy paradox can be described as I'm desperate to be fully known. That's this hunger for social and relational harmony. I'm desperate to be fully known, but I'm also terrified of being found out. And when you add to that this now insistence that I build my own silo of identity, it makes it easier for me to resist what's necessary for me to satisfy this hunger and remain aloof and unknown and detached. And yet I still experience the consequences of that aloofness and detachment because the hunger is still there. So I think I have maybe one more. We belong to each other because we are designed as specific role players in a story much larger than ourselves. That's a logical proposition on what it means to belong and to be attached and be in community. We belong to each other because we are designed as specific role players, and that's part of our design and purpose by our intelligent designer. We belong to each other because we are designed as specific role players in a story much larger than ourselves. Illogical. Let me just narrow this down. Let me make it clear. From a biblical perspective, this design is male and female, and it's male and female so that we can live out the mandates and the responsibilities under God's authority that we've been given. But all those things are now being thrown off. The first thing that's been thrown off decades ago is the common understanding that there is a designer, and now materialism and Darwinian evolution is the random source of our origin. So therefore, once we throw him out, then everything else, the design, the purpose, and now even the male and female, The two complementary coming together so that families are made, children are propagated, and cultures are both populated and advanced. All that is now that's actually on the other side of the equation when it comes to recent propositions on human flourishing. If you feel like that you're someone who has to hold to these original design, complementary male and female gender roles, and these orientations towards this kind of family with this kind of faithfulness, propagating children so that their generations can continue in the same pattern, then you are someone who is anti-flourishing and you must be dealt with. And we can make those propositions all we want, but the consequences are showing themselves. Detachment, isolation and loneliness, a lack of belonging, and the tragic consequences that come from those realities as time goes on. You cannot violate reality. And yet that is what we are most insistent on doing in these days in our zip code. That is what's illogical in proposition, that there is no design, there is no male-female, there is no specific purpose for each, there is no roles. Roles are oppressive. And if you try to fit me in or insist that I play what I see in the mirror, then therefore you are to be dealt with most even violently when it comes, at this point, only to status and opinion and maybe some vocational opportunities, and that's where it is right now. But we can, and we are making all these propositions on human flourishing that are degrading to the image that we've been given by our designer. And anytime I violate with unnatural intent the natural understanding of who I am, I have to experience consequences. I can't step off a 3-story building and say, there's no consequences here. But splat is always the result of an image bearer violating the reality of the image woven into him and her. And I just can't help just reflecting on my time in team sports. And I'm a member of a great church and I have a great family, but there's just something so poignantly acute about being part of a team that gives you all three of those needs. It gives you attachment to something and a story that you're writing with these guys or gals. It gives you not loneliness. It gives you companionship and community. And just there's some inside stories and inside jokes, and you're constantly sharpening each other. And then there's just this belonging that, man, I got you. And we don't even have to be playing anymore. I mean, I talked to guys that I played ball with 30 years ago. I'm really good friends with the guy that, he played college ball, and we played in a ton of leagues after college together, and we still talk all the time. But there's just something about this shared humanity and this shared understanding of what it means to do life together under this banner of consistent and persistent truth. And so 1 is the loneliest number. And if you're somebody struggling with detachment and the despair that comes and loneliness, gosh, I'd love to offer you some care. Just reach out to us. We have a ton of great resources that are available. But I guess for now, find hope in Team Humanity, and I would say find hope in Team Jesus. For the Pinocchio Project, this is Mitch Friedman signing off.